We've already added color, right, to the sketches we did the first week when we recreated an artwork. We looked at how to add simple colors there. And so what I want to do now is go into how do we add more specific colors? What are the different ways that we can add color? And so we're going to look at like all the different types of color values that we can use. Um, so I'm going to be starting with a self-portrait, and I'm just going to add some colors in here. I may add some stuff to demonstrate different things, but that's what I'm going to be using as kind of my base design. So we already went over kind of all the shapes on Monday, and so now we'll talk about some colors. Um, and so, as we kind of have looked at, we have these two different ways of applying color to our scene. One is the fill, which fills in the shape. If we look at the shapes that we've got on the screen right now, the white areas are that fill area. So the inside of the shape by default, if we don't set a fill, is going to have a white fill. And then the stroke is the outline around the shape. And in some cases, mainly the line, but there's other ways that we can have shapes that don't have a fill. The line only has a stroke. So the lines that we added for the nose, I guess there's just one line, only has the default black stroke. There's no fill there. So those are our two main ways of adding color. And we have a lot of different like ways of values that we can use. So if I add in something here, I'm just going to put it up at the top here. So if I say fill is white, we're not going to see any difference because that's the default value. If I change the fill to something else like black, we can reverse these values. Then we get the inside color is black. And remember, this is a string value, and the string value really corresponds to CSS. So if you guys have taken any CSS courses, like you probably did a little bit in MMP 100, maybe some of the other courses you've taken, maybe you've looked at it on your own. CSS basically is the styling that we add to a web page, and we haven't talked about this yet. We'll do it later, but our P5 page actually has its own style sheet, and I could change things. Like I could give this whole thing a background color. I could say background color is light blue. And you can see my sketch page, not the canvas, because this is the HTML around the canvas, not the canvas itself. But my sketch page turned blue. And so that's where the name colors come from. They come from the CSS standard. And so CSS has a bunch of shortcuts for different color names that we can use to style elements on an HTML page. And so basically P5 has an encoded version of that because they figure, if you're writing JavaScript, you probably have seen CSS before, so you may already be familiar with these colors. And all the CSS color names you can find on this HTML color codes chart. If we go to HTML color names, we can see the colors. We can go to colors by, the sort of main color umbrella. Like if we want, let's see, let's give our character a purple color. We can go down to purple and we can see there's lavender, there's thistle, there's plum, and these are just kind of shortcuts for what's really these encoded color values. So that's the next thing that we'll look at. So let's say instead of fill black, I want to use fill plum for my character, for my self-portrait. So now we're applying that plum color to all of those values. So I, this is a string value, meaning that we have to use quotation marks. So if I take out these quotation marks here, oops, it's going to break. And the reason for that is not going to make sense quite yet, but we will talk about it next week. So I'm not going to go into it right now because it's a little bit of a tangent, but we will talk about it next week. So it'll make sense then. So I need to, for those string values to work, I need them to have quotation marks. They can be single quotation marks or double quotation marks. JavaScript is fine with either one. You can't mix them though. If I put like a single quotation mark in the front and a double quotation mark in the back, I'm going to get an error there. So you can use either one. It doesn't really matter. I tend to use single quotation marks, but different people have different preferences. I also have to make sure to spell the color right. I think it'll work if I use a capital P, but if I have like, I don't know, some just extra letters in here, it's not going to work. So you have to get the spelling right. You know, that probably makes sense. So that's how I can do a fill. And notice that the fill applies to everything that comes later in my sketch. So if I apply another fill after this, let's say after the body and the head, I apply another fill. And let's just choose a color. I'm going to go up here. Um, what did I use? I used plum. Where did plum go? Here it is. Maybe we can choose one of these color schemes. If I go back to the picker, kind of gives me this like color scheme over here, which is kind of nice. And I can choose different. This is actually basically the same thing as the Adobe Color website. So anyway, let's choose a nice complementary color of the plum. It's green. It's gonna look kind of weird actually. Let's go with a triadic color. This is gonna look a little bit better. Let's go with this nice blue. So this blue color doesn't actually have a name in HTML. So what I can do instead is I can just take this hex value and I can also do a hex value. This is also going to be a string. So when I do a hex value, it has to start with a hashtag. This is just another CSS thing. It's just the CSS standard. And then we have this kind of weird syntax that gives us this new color. Okay, so now we have the blue fill. And so notice the plum fill only applies to these shapes here. And then my blue fill applies to everything that comes after it. So the order that we apply the colors in is important. And so, you have to just make sure if you want something to be the right color, you just have to put the fill before that color. This is a hex value, and I'm also just going to put a note here that this is light blue-ish. It's not exactly light blue, but it's light blue-ish. And P5 actually does this thing where it adds a little color picker here. This is a relatively new feature, but it's kind of nice because you can actually see a preview of what that color is going to look like, and you can change it. I'm not going to do that quite yet, but you can change it there if you want to. Okay, so those are our fills. Then the stroke is completely unrelated to the fill. We only can change the stroke by using the stroke keyword. So if I want to change the stroke to something, maybe like yellow would probably go with this decently. It's a little bright. Maybe I'll try, let's see if we can find a good yellow. Or actually, this one is right here. Let's do that one. Let's just use another hex value. That's a little too light, but maybe if I make the background darker. Let's actually talk about that in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to leave that for now. So I have that light stroke, but I might not want to apply the stroke to everything. So I can move the stroke down. I'm going to move the stroke down here to this where this fill is. But notice that I still get that sort of light gold stroke on the self-portrait. And so remember, we talked about this on Monday. Our draw function is constantly running. So even though this stroke is below the rectangle and the ellipse, because we're going back to the beginning every time we run our draw function, since I'm not changing the stroke up at the top here, the stroke color stays the same. So it doesn't reset the defaults if I change it. So we can use our no stroke if I want to get rid of the stroke. Remember, we can turn the stroke off. We can also do that with the fill. So let's say I don't want my eyes to have this fill here. I could say I could move the fill down. Let's move it down here. And down here, when I change the stroke, I could also say no fill. Okay, so that looks okay. That's kind of weird, but whatever. And so no fill and no stroke, just turn the fill and the stroke off until I turn it back on. So here I'm turning the fill back on, so we see the fill come back for these last two shapes. So again, it's just the order. You probably noticed that the fill, the no stroke and no fill look a little bit different because they have a capital letter in them. So this is just a real quick tangent. This is called camel case. In camel case, in code, we can't put a space between our um, functions or variables. It makes them, it just doesn't, we're just not allowed to do that. We can't use spaces in that way. We have to use spaces for things like this, where we separate a keyword and a function name. So camel case starts lowercase. The first word is always lowercase, and then the words afterwards are capitalized. So there's this like hump like a camel. Capitalize other words. So if I had a variable or a function name like my cool function, I would capitalize cool and function. And so that's why we get camel case, because it looks like there's these bumps. So we start lowercase and then we capitalize words after it. It doesn't actually change anything in the code, but it just makes it look better. Although once you define the function like no stroke, it does matter. So if I say no stroke with a lowercase s, I'm going to get an error there, and it's not going to do what I wanted it to do. So that if you see that happen, you might have misspelled it, but you might have also gotten the capitalization off. You see that with create canvas as well. I guess we've seen that before, but it just kind of stood out when we're looking at it here. Oh, we also saw it with stroke weight and rect mode. So we did actually use that a couple times on Monday. I just didn't mention it. All right, so let's go back to what I was talking about before, but so we talked about the named values, and this looks like CSS, and we talked about no stroke and no fill, and we talked about stroke weight. Actually, this isn't specific to color, so we did talk about this on Monday. You can see we use stroke weight here. Um, Obviously, if I increase the stroke weight, I get wider strokes. If I decrease it, I get smaller strokes. So it's pretty straightforward. And then we talked about hex values. So again, this is a CSS thing, and I won't go into too much detail with this, but basically, your hex value is just a representation of RGB. You guys have probably learned this before, but just in case you haven't, let's take a look at this color that we have. Um, we basically have a few different ways of describing this color. So RGB is kind of like physically how our computer works. Each one of the pixels on our computer screen has a red, a green, and a blue pixel in it, different little lights. And the way that we get different colors is by combining different amounts of those lights. And so you can see for this particular color, there's 221 red, 221 green, and 160 blue. And that kind of makes sense because it's a light purple color, so there's going to be more red. Um, it's interesting that there's an even amount of green, and then there's a little less blue, but the numbers are larger because we have a lighter color. So if I move this color, so I'm not going to change the hue. This wheel over here is for the hue. Um, and the hue, it just basically describes where it is in our color spectrum. So from red to yellow, green, blue, pink, and red. So I'm not going to change the hue. I'm going to leave that the same. But if I drag this little guy around, when I get darker, closer to black. I'll still be a little bit pink, but I'm closer to black. Notice that all of these numbers are lower. So the hue is actually the same. The relationship between red, green, and blue is the same, but the numbers are all lower. We have 100 red, 50 green, and 100 blue. So as we get closer to black, those numbers go down. As we get closer to white over here, those numbers go up. And the top value, you guys have definitely heard this before, but the top value for any red, green, or blue is 255. That's just the basic color standard that most of our computers are using. And the reason we have 255 is essentially that we can represent 1 byte of data. 1 byte of data on your computer can represent numbers between 0 and 255. And that's because it's encoded in binary. Again, I won't go into a whole long thing about this, but you've probably heard about binary before. It's a way to represent numbers with 0 and 1s. So if I want to represent 0, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 That's 1 byte. So 8 characters. Uh, so each one of these zeros represents a bit, 1 bit, and a byte is 8 bits. So this is 1 byte here, and it's kind of like the smallest basic unit of information that we can store on the computer. And when we write in binary, each one of these numbers represents a different value. So this one represents 1, this is 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. And the kind of clever thing about that is I can represent all these different numbers. So by turning on and off these bytes, so for example, if I do like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, let's say I do 1, 0, 1, what I end up with here is I have 1, 4, this is a 4, and I have 1, 1, and so 1 plus 4 gives me 5. And so I can use this to represent the number 5. And this obviously looks like a lot more data than the number 5, but on the computer, everything is already just a 0 or a 1. So we need a clever way of representing different numbers. Okay, so coming back to that, that's why we get the 0 to 255. And that's also why we have this hex number. What a hex number is basically using 2 digits to represent a number between 0 and 255. So normally, if you have 2 digits, you can represent 0 up to 99. But once you want to represent 100 in normal base 10, which is what we use for numbers, you have 3 digits. Okay, so to compress that, make it a little bit smaller, what they did is they have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then they added A, B, C, D, E, F to the end. So they added 6 more characters so you can represent more number values. So FF actually is equal to 255. And 0, 0 obviously equals 0. So all of these are just basically different nerdy computer ways of representing these numbers to tell us how much color we want. Okay, so now that we've covered that, we can get into, so we have these hex values. That's why those numbers look the way they do. They use letters, but they're actually representing number values. So we can use those hex values. We already did that. But now we can also use just regular numbers. Okay, so this is what I was talking about before. You've probably looked at this and I think we mentioned it before. This background doesn't have a color, it has a number. And what that number represents is a grayscale value. Grayscale is when all of the colors have the exact same value. So if all of my colors are 255, I'm going to get white. If all of them are 0, I get black. But if I want something gray, I'm going to add a little bit more light. But as long as they're all the same, they sort of cancel each other out. As long as the red and the green and the blue are balanced, I get something that has no color. It's grayscale. So if I want to represent that, since I know the numbers are always going to be the same, I can represent the value as one number. So if I want to make my background lighter, I can increase this. So 255 is going to be white. I can decrease it if I want it to be darker. So if I want like a really light background, I could do like 50, or sorry, dark background. So it's not quite black, but it's a little bit darker, and it looks kind of nicer with that gold color. So I think I'm going to stick with that. So we can represent grayscale colors um, using one number. Okay, so there's just a couple more things that we want to go over. So we looked at these red, green, blue values. And the funny thing about P5 is there's actually 2 ways to do this, so it may be kind of confusing. But let's say I was looking at that gold value. Let's say I wasn't quite happy with this, and so I can actually click on this and I can move it around and I can say, what if I did that instead? Whoops. Oh, it's glitching out. I'm gonna refresh. I'm gonna save this and refresh. Try that again. Okay. Okay. So if I want to change this, I can click on this color. Maybe I want to make it a little bit brighter, maybe a little more orange. I can choose different things. There's also some suggested colors down here. When I'm ready, I can hit enter. And now it's created this new color. So that So that's a good way to preview different colors, but I can also change the type of color I'm using from hex to RGB to HSL. Okay, so if we go to RGB, now we're using colors based on those red, green, blue values. The thing that's kind of weird about this is that CSS can represent RGB, and the way it represents it is with this style of rule. So this is technically a string. But in P5, I don't need a string to represent RGB. I can just use the numbers. So if I get rid of these, now I just have a number. Although it kind of looked like it changed color. Uh, so that's kind of weird, but that's okay. So one of the advantages of this, let me choose a different color because it looks kind of weird. So I'm just going to take these RGB values right here and copy them and paste them in. So one disadvantage here is my preview color is gone. I can't move the colors around anymore. But one advantage of this is I can manipulate these colors with code, which we're not going to work on that quite yet, but we'll start doing stuff like that soon. Another advantage of this is I can add transparency. So let's add another color. Actually, let's add, where could we add some transparency? There's nothing that's really like overlapping. So I'll have to add something that's transparent. I can add some glasses. That's a good transparent thing to add. So let's add a couple circles where the eyeballs are. And I'm just going to make these bigger. So make them like 20. Okay. And then let's move this fill up a little bit. Or actually, I'm not going to be able to make this fill transparent. So I'm going to figure out what the RGB values are for this fill. So if I click on RGB, can copy those. And so I'm going to put a fill here with just the numbers. Okay, and I'm going to say no stroke. Okay, and then I'll bring that stroke back later. So let's take this stroke and add it back down here. Okay, and oh, I have my eyes down here. Okay, let's move this whole bit to after the little eyeballs. So I'm just copying and pasting and moving it down, although I screwed something up. Oh, I just screwed up this comment. Okay, so now I can make these glasses. So I'm going to say left glasses, right glasses. Okay, and let's make them actually a little bit bigger. So they're covering a couple things. And then here's the cool part. I can add transparency. So this fill right here is setting the color for the glasses here. And I still need to bring my stroke back again. So let's bring that down here. Okay, so again, this fill is setting the glasses color here. And right now I can't see through the glasses, like I can't see the eyes behind them. But I can add transparency. That's the fourth optional value. So I can go in here and I can say the transparency goes from 0 to 255 as well. So I can add like something like half of that, like 127 is going to be half transparent. And I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. I'm going to do like 200 so I can see the glasses a bit better. That's a little too much. Let's do like 180. Okay, so it's a little bit small. My self-portrait is kind of small. Um, but you can probably see that, like you can see through those fills. So you can add this extra dynamic. Let's make the glasses even a little bit bigger. So I can like add multiple colors on top of each other. And we can use transparency to be able to blend the colors together. So that's the fourth option when you're doing either a fill or a stroke. You can add that transparency in there if you want to add a fourth value. Okay, so I think I've covered all of the different possibilities. So there's obviously a lot you can do with color. There's a lot more, different colors that you can use. You can apply them to the shapes in lots of different ways. The main thing that you have to just keep in mind is the order. So if you want to reuse a stroke, like I kept having to move this stroke around. Let's put a little yellow comment on here. So this stroke in particular, because I wanted to apply it to the eyes, but then I wanted to apply it to these shapes down here. So I had to use it up here. Here's my yellow stroke again. Um, and then I drew the eyes here. Uh, and then I guess I don't need it here. I can take it out there. But then I had to turn the stroke off here because I didn't want the glasses to have the stroke. So then I drew my glasses, and then I had to bring the stroke back down here because I wanted to, have these shapes at the bottom have that same stroke. So you kind of have to like figure out where the colors go as you're drawing. Um, so yeah, that's all of the different ways that we can do color with P5. It does, it takes a little while to get used to it. And a couple things, we're going to do some debugging. Um, not next week because we only have one class, but the week after. But you're going to run into issues where you forget the number of colors or you forget a comma or something like that. Since we're still learning this stuff, that's another thing just to look for. Just make sure you have the right, you have a number, a comma, a number, a comma. And if you have errors, like something that happens a lot when you first start coding is you'll run your code and nothing is there. And that usually means there's an error. You can look in the console and, you can ask me or you can ask another student, and we might be able to take a look at it and see where that error is coming from. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to put a link to this in the voice chat if you guys want to take a look at this. You can also look at previous students' work. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but if you want to take a look at what students have done in the past for this assignment, you can go to the MMP 210 homepage and go to the examples page. I have to update this with a couple more recent semesters, but if you go, oh wait, this is my examples, not examples, student work. Okay, so yeah, here. So you can see student projects, and so you might see like a self-portrait. Uh-oh, looks like this is gone. Sometimes they get rid of these. I do think I have a backup of this one, so I'll have to replace it, but let's see if we can find another one. Let's see. Here's a self-portrait. Okay, so there's a self-portrait from a few semesters ago. So you can see examples of things that students have done in the past. And previous semesters are on Open Lab, so that's what I need to add some links in here to those Open Lab courses. I'll do that during demo time. Um, so yeah, let me know if you guys have questions. We can use the rest of the class time just to work on this first self-portrait assignment. So, you have a good amount of time. So feel free to like really play around with stuff. I wouldn't worry about getting it, as I mentioned, perfect the first time. You have some time to just like try stuff. If it doesn't work, try something else. So just get used to things, just like start playing around with stuff. And hopefully that'll be a good way to familiarize yourself with this new platform. Oh, let me stop the recording.